Stop right there. Boy, before I put you on the ground where you belong. Those words, thrown out with contempt on a quiet autumn morning, would be the first crack in Officer Daniel Ramirez's career. A moment he believed would show his authority, but instead would end his life in law enforcement. His fist struck Judge Elijah Marcus Thompson before the judge could even lift his credentials, the punch landing with a sharp burst of pain that split the inside of his mouth and sent his briefcase tumbling across the stone steps. The impact jolted his head, and the humiliation cut deeper than the injury. Because he knew exactly what was happening and exactly how many times this scene had unfolded for others who had no power to fight back. As the officer's forearm pressed into his throat and the metal cuffs tore into his wrists, a single question rose through the haze of pain. How many careers are built on moments just like this? And how many fall apart the second the truth finally surfaces? And for you watching this unfold, what would you do if you saw justice turn around and strike back in the same instant? Before we go deeper into this story, tell me where you are watching from. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so more people can follow these powerful stories of accountability and truth. Judge Elijah Marcus Thompson had begun that morning with the steady patience of a man who believed in order, preparation, and the quiet dignity of public service. He stepped off the MARTA train at 5 points, adjusting the strap of the leather briefcase he had carried for almost 2 decades. His Mercedes refused to start the night before, so he made the practical choice to take the train. After 18 years on the federal bench, he had learned that a small inconvenience did not disturb a day's purpose. What mattered was the meeting scheduled for 8:37 a.m. inside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building. 2 Justice Department attorneys waited for his final review of the preliminary findings from a 14-month investigation into racial profiling and excessive force within the Atlanta Police Department. Elijah had guided the investigation with a calm, steady hand, knowing that confronting long-standing patterns required patience, evidence, and resolve. He walked toward the courthouse steps with quiet focus, the early autumn air cool enough to sharpen thought. He carried no robe, no visible symbol of power, only civilian clothes, a briefcase, and the certainty of who he was. That choice, simple as it seemed, would determine everything that followed. Ramirez spotted him halfway up the steps. The officer's posture stiffened, jaw tightening with instinctive suspicion. He saw a black man in plain clothes approaching a federal entrance with confidence. He formed a conclusion before a single word was spoken. His hand drifted toward the holstered Glock at his hip. Not out of caution, but out of habit. A habit shaped by years of unchecked complaints, quiet settlements, and supervisors who rarely questioned his narrative. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" His voice carried authority but no professionalism. Command without restraint. Elijah paused and turned toward him, offering the steady composure that had calmed countless hostile courtrooms. "Officer, I work here," Elijah said. His tone was even, polite. "I am Judge Elijah Thompson." The laugh that followed was dismissive, sharp, and dripping with derision. "Yeah, sure. Every thug says that. ID. Now." Elijah moved slowly, deliberately. He had overseen hundreds of cases involving police force. He understood how speed, even innocent speed, could be misinterpreted. He reached toward the inside of his jacket to retrieve his credentials. But the moment his hand shifted, Ramirez acted on his own narrative. His fist shot forward, fueled by contempt rather than threat. It struck Elijah's cheekbone with enough force to blur his vision. The pain pulsed in waves, warm and immediate. Elijah tried to steady himself, but Ramirez seized his collar and slammed him against the cold stone wall. The pressure of the officer's forearm tightened across his throat, cutting off breath with a force that felt both physical and personal. People like you belong behind bars. Not in my courthouse, Ramirez whispered with a venom he no longer tried to hide. Officers Miguel Santos and Kyle Bennett stood several feet away, recording with their phones and laughing with the easy confidence of men who believed consequences never reached their circle. Their amusement stung almost as deeply as the blow itself. Elijah had seen this scene before, testified about it, written about it in rulings and dissents. But he had never lived it from the ground level, never felt the sting of the pavement through a shirt, never heard someone laugh as he struggled for breath. His briefcase had burst open on the steps, scattering documents he had guarded closely, data tables, affidavits, internal affairs files. The pages drifted across the entrance. The results of 14 months of investigation exposed to the wind and the contempt of 3 officers who assumed he was just another anonymous man to be handled and dismissed. A flush of humiliation rose in Elijah's chest, not from shame but from the jarring realization that in an instant his identity, his authority, and his dignity had been stripped away by men who had no idea who he was. Elijah did not resist. He knew resistance would become the cornerstone of their fabricated story. Ramirez shoved his arm behind his back and snapped the handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The metal bit into his skin with a cold insistence. Santos continued recording, narrating the lie even before it formed. Elbowed the officer, non-compliant. We got him. Elijah listened to their words with a quiet stillness that masked a storm beneath the surface. He thought of his son, handcuffed face down on a sidewalk in 2015, accused of matching a description that never existed. He thought of the families who had sat in his courtroom recounting similar stories, trembling as they recited the lies used to justify force, and he understood now, in the most intimate way, the weight of those moments. The walk into the courthouse felt surreal. Every step echoed a truth he had taught for years. Power misused corrodes everything it touches. Ramirez pushed him through the doorway with a rough shove. Elijah stumbled, his cheek burning, his wrists aching, and his mind methodically cataloging every detail, every word, every gesture, every inconsistency. The humiliation cut deep, but deeper still was the clarity settling over him. What happened on these steps would not end here. Justice would not shout. It would wait, steady and patient, until the evidence revealed what power tried to hide. And still, the quiet question lingered, as if carried on the breath of the morning air, when brutality is delivered with such confidence. How often do we witness the astonishing moment when it turns back on the one who started it? 37 minutes after the punch. The sting of the cold metal still lingered around Elijah Thompson's wrists as he sat at the defendant's table in courtroom 2201. His cheek had begun to swell, the discoloration forming a dark bruise that reached toward his temple. In 18 years on the federal bench, he had walked into countless hearings with calm authority. Now he entered the same room in silence, handcuffed, bruised, and treated as a criminal before a gallery of strangers who had no idea who he was. The murmurs in the courtroom faded the moment the marshal closed the door. The officers who assaulted him walked in casually, shoulders loose, confidence unshaken. They believed they owned the narrative. They believed they owned the room. Judge Robert Hayes entered with a measured gait, robe trailing behind him, unaware of the storm waiting beneath the surface. He had covered Elijah's docket for the past week, never imagining he would preside over a hearing involving the man whose portrait hung in the lobby downstairs. He gave a short nod, lifted the gavel, and called the court to order. Elijah watched him with a steady, unreadable expression, knowing the next hour would determine the first crack in the officer's story. Ramirez was the first to speak. He took the witness stand with an air of polished confidence, the kind that came from years of rehearsed testimonies. His voice was steady, his posture straight, his tone respectful. "Your Honor," At approximately 8:42 this morning, I observed a suspicious individual attempting to bypass security screening. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. When confronted, the subject refused to provide identification, became verbally aggressive, and attempted to push past me. I used the minimum force necessary to gain control of the situation. Elijah listened without blinking. He felt each lie fall into place with practiced ease. Ramirez described him as hostile, non-compliant, and threatening. He spoke of a physical altercation, carefully avoiding words that might reveal too much. He used phrases he had used before, phrases designed to trigger automatic trust in officers and immediate suspicion toward the accused. Every word ran alongside his history. 35 complaints, none resolved publicly, all settled or dismissed quietly. Officer Miguel Santos followed, confirming the story with an identical sequence. Every detail matched perfectly, too perfectly. His voice never wavered as he spoke. He stared straight ahead, ignoring the man he had recorded suffering on the courthouse steps. Bennett gave the same account, adding small embellishments meant to solidify the image of Elijah as someone aggressive and dangerous. Their unity was not discipline. It was habit, a familiar, coordinated choreography repeated in hearings for years. Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Mitchell stood at the prosecution table, her face composed, her voice controlled. She had prosecuted hundreds of cases built on officer testimony. She believed she understood the patterns. She trusted the system that had, for so long, trusted her. She rose when Ramirez finished and addressed the court with calm authority. Your Honor, given the officer's consistent statements and the subject's refusal to comply with lawful commands, the government moves to charge the defendant with criminal trespass on federal property, resisting arrest, and assault on a law enforcement officer. The words carried a weight that filled the room. Elijah felt the familiar pressure of the legal machine turning, grinding forward without hesitation. He had warned young prosecutors for years that the truth often appeared silent when lies marched in step. He sat still, observing, remembering, absorbing every detail. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Defendant, do you have counsel present? Elijah remained seated. Not at this time. Your Honor, would you like the court to appoint? No. Your Honor. His voice was calm, even controlled, for the first time since entering the room. A whisper passed through the gallery. Something in his tone did not match the image painted by the officers. It carried confidence, authority, experience. Hayes shifted slightly. There was something in the defendant's posture, something in the quiet deliberation behind his eyes. That unsettled the simplicity of the officer's narrative. He cleared his throat. Very well. You may respond to the charges. Elijah rose slowly. The handcuffs made the movement stiff and deliberate. He felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward him. He felt the sting in his cheek each time he spoke. Your Honor, before addressing any charges, I request the immediate preservation of all courthouse security footage from 8:30 to 9 o'clock all body camera backups from officers Ramirez, Santos, and Bennett, and any cell phone recordings made during the encounter. Mitchell looked toward him with surprise. On what grounds? Elijah turned his attention back to the judge. Pursuant to Brady v. Maryland and this district's standing preservation order, the footage is material to my defense. The room shifted. Something had changed. Ramirez stiffened. Santos lowered his gaze. Bennett swallowed hard. Hayes frowned. Sir, are you an attorney? The gallery leaned forward, sensing something unusual in the air. Elijah met the judge's eyes. I am United States District Judge Elijah Marcus Thompson. I have presided in this courtroom for 18 years. A sharp, collective gasp swept through the room. The moment stretched into silence. Laura Mitchell stepped back, her face draining of color. Santos froze, Jaw tightening, Bennett turned nearly white, and Ramirez, the man who had thrown the punch, stared at Elijah with a widening horror that broke through his practiced composure. Sarah Jenkins, the young law clerk seated near the back row, pressed a hand against her mouth. She had walked past Elijah's framed portrait every morning for nearly 2 years. It now felt as if the wall itself had stepped forward to confront its own history. Hayes stood from the bench. His robe shifted with the motion. His breath caught in his throat. "Judge Thompson, I had no idea." "You were not expected to," Elijah replied, his tone steady but not unkind. "I was in civilian clothing. I was on my way to our meeting with the Justice Department. I did not reach the door before I was assaulted." Ramirez's hands trembled. He remembered now. 4 years earlier. This very courtroom. A case dismissed after Elijah found his search affidavit materially false. He recalled the firm voice of the judge who refused to let misconduct hide behind procedure. He remembered the reprimand embedded in the ruling. And now he realized the man he struck was the same man who had held him accountable before. The courtroom filled with a tension that felt almost tangible. The story the officers had built, a story they repeated with confidence, a story they believed could not be challenged, had begun to crumble under the weight of truth. Elijah remained standing, silent, watching as the first cracks in their narrative spread across the room. And for the first time that morning, the power dynamic shifted, not through anger, not through shouting, but through the calm, steady presence of a man who knew the law, lived the law, and now stood ready to expose every lie spoken against him. The courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness as Elijah Thompson remained standing, his bruised cheek catching the soft light above the bench. Judge Hayes steadied himself, torn between shock and duty. The officers sat rigid in their seats, their coordinated narrative, so confident minutes earlier, now trembled under the weight of a truth none of them had anticipated. Elijah placed both hands on the table before him, the handcuffs still biting into his wrists, and addressed the court with the calm conviction of a man who had spent a lifetime teaching the law to those who thought they mastered it. "Your Honor," he said, "in accordance with Brady v. Maryland, and in compliance with this district's standing preservation order, I renew my request for immediate preservation of all courthouse security footage from the period of 8:30 to 9 o'clock this morning, all body camera backups uploaded to the cloud, and all cell phone videos recorded by officers Ramirez, Santos, and Bennett." The words were measured, deliberate, and delivered as if he were still wearing the robe removed from him hours earlier. The courtroom reacted with a soft ripple, a collective sense that something large, unseen, was shifting beneath their feet. Judge Hayes leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if clarity required proximity. "Judge Thompson," he said slowly, "are you asserting that the officer's testimony was untruthful?" Elijah met his gaze without hesitation. "I am asserting that the evidence will speak for itself." "Your Honor." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ramirez shifted in his chair, the first sign of discomfort crossing his face. His fingers twitched near his belt line, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The instinct of a man used to controlling the story, suddenly realizing the story was slipping away. Elijah's words had cracked the facade, but the true fracture came in the reaction of the gallery. Sarah Jenkins, the young law clerk who had recognized Elijah moments earlier, rose halfway from her seat before catching herself. Her eyes moved from the bruise along Elijah's cheek to the rigid posture of the officers, and then back to the bench where Judge Hayes sat with a troubled expression. It was clear to her now that everything unfolding in front of her was not a misunderstanding. It was not confusion. It was the beginning of a revelation powerful enough to reshape the institution she had only just begun to serve. Santos avoided eye contact entirely. staring down at the floor as if the wood grain held a safer truth than the one unraveling before him. Bennett swallowed, throat tightening, the realization of exposure creeping across his shoulders like a cold draft. But Ramirez, always the leader among them, held his chin high and forced his expression into defiant neutrality. Years of practice hardened him, but even his discipline began to falter as Elijah continued speaking. "My wallet is in my left jacket pocket," Elijah said evenly. "Inside it is a federal judicial identification card with my name, photograph, and signature. It was never requested. It was never examined. The moment I reached to retrieve it, I was struck without cause." His voice remained calm, but each word carried the weight of the morning's violence. He turned slightly toward the officers. "Not one of you asked who I was. Not one of you allowed me to comply. Your narrative begins with refusal. The evidence will show I was not permitted to speak." Mitchell, the prosecutor who only minutes earlier requested immediate charges, stepped forward with uncertainty clouding her face. "Your Honor," she said, "given this new information, the government may need additional time to reassess the situation." Her tone was controlled but no longer confident. Elijah watched her carefully. He knew the difference between a prosecutor defending a case and a prosecutor realizing the case had been built on sand. Judge Hayes tapped a finger against the desk, a steady, rhythmic sound betraying his rising concern. "Officers," he said, "please step forward." The three men exchanged brief glances, their unity shaken. They approached with stiff movements, each step revealing the growing crack beneath their coordinated lies. Hayes studied them with a gaze Elijah recognized, an experienced judge evaluating witnesses whose confidence no longer matched their testimony. "Did any of you request identification?" Hayes asked. Ramirez answered first. "Your Honor." The subject became aggressive before we could complete standard procedures. "Did he refuse to provide identification?" "He failed to comply with verbal commands," Ramirez insisted, though the certainty in his voice wavered. Hayes turned to Santos. "Is this accurate?" Santos hesitated. It was the first true pause he had shown since the hearing began. He did move his hand toward his jacket. "After you requested identification?" Santos hesitated again. We told him to stop. "That is not the same question," Hayes replied sharply. The crack widened. Bennett tried to salvage the story. "Your Honor," he acted suspiciously. "We had to ensure officer safety." Hayes lifted a hand. "Suspicion is not a substitute for truth." A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Elijah could feel the shift, subtle but unmistakable. The story the officers had woven was beginning to unravel. Elijah stood again. "Your Honor, I would also request that the court-martial retrieve my briefcase from the courthouse steps. Inside are sealed documents pertaining to an active Justice Department investigation into systemic misconduct within the Atlanta Police Department. Those documents were opened and scattered when I was struck. Their contents are now part of the record of this morning's events." Ramirez's composure broke. His eyes widened as he understood the gravity of what Elijah had carried. This was no random encounter. This was a collision with the man leading the very investigation that could dismantle the culture he had relied on for years. This was not bad luck. This was the moment accountability had chosen to arrive. Hayes exhaled slowly, the truth settling over him like a heavy mantle. "Judge Thompson," he said, I believe we need a recess to evaluate the seriousness of these claims." His voice carried the weight of a man realizing he had almost presided over a wrongful conviction of a colleague. The marshal stepped forward, with deliberate care. He unlocked Elijah's handcuffs. The metallic click echoed through the room and landed with symbolic force. Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the gesture, then flexed his wrists gently as circulation returned. The officers remained standing, caught between disbelief and fear. For the first time since the morning began, they looked small, not because of physical stature, but because the truth had stripped away the authority they relied on. Their power had rested on silence, on the assumption that their story would go unchallenged. But now the silence had broken. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Elijah gathered himself with quiet dignity. The bruise along his cheek pulsed, a reminder of the violence he endured. But his mind remained sharp, anchored in purpose. He knew this moment was more than a personal violation. It was the first crack in a structure that had hidden misconduct for too long, and once a crack appears, the rest of the truth does not simply follow, it floods. The courtroom emptied into a hushed corridor, but the tension inside room 2201 did not fade. It settled into the empty benches, the polished railings, and the air itself. Elijah Marcus Thompson stood quietly at the defense table, rubbing the tender skin around his wrists as the marshal finished removing the cuffs. The bruise along his cheek had darkened to deep violet, a stark reminder of the blow that had begun this morning's spiral into injustice. Yet the expression on his face carried neither anger nor spectacle. It held something steadier, something unshakable. The officers watched him from across the room, each one standing rigid, the first tremors of fear visible in the tightness around their mouths. For the first time in their careers, they faced a man they could not silence. A man who knew the law more intimately than any of them. A man they had assaulted before sunrise, unaware that he was the judge who had spent years documenting their department's misconduct. And now, the power they had misused drifted out of their reach with quiet inevitability. The 20-minute recess began, but no one moved quickly. Hayes stepped down from the bench slowly, his face pale with dawning realization. As he passed Elijah, he paused. "Judge Thompson, I am deeply sorry." Elijah inclined his head. "Thank you. Robert, the facts will guide us." The calmness in his voice steadied Hayes more than an apology ever could. The judge exited through the side door, leaving Elijah standing alone in a courtroom he had commanded for nearly 2 decades. For the first time since the blow on the granite steps, he allowed his shoulders to relax. He inhaled deeply, drawing strength not from pride, but from purpose. Then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the aisle. Bailiff Henry Lawson, 22 years in the same building, the man who had opened Elijah's courtroom every morning, arrived with the urgency of someone who had just learned the truth too late. He had spent the recess racing through the courthouse. He had checked the security office, spoken with the marshal, and pieced together what had occurred. His face was flushed with sorrow and disbelief. He approached Elijah with reverence. "Judge, I had no idea. I am so sorry. Elijah lifted a hand gently. "Henry, it is all right. We are here now." But Henry shook his head, his voice breaking. "Not all right. Never should have happened. Not to you." He reached into the garment bag draped over his arm. "I went upstairs. I brought your robe." The moment felt almost ceremonial. Henry unzipped the bag and lifted the black robe with both hands, as though carrying a mantle of memory and authority. Elijah looked at it. The familiar fabric he had worn through trials of grief, mercy, and national consequence. A robe is not a shield. He had always told young clerks, it is a responsibility. Yet today, after being stripped of dignity by those sworn to protect it, the robe symbolized something deeper. Restoration. Henry held it out. Elijah slid his arms into the sleeves with deliberate grace as the fabric settled over his shoulders. The room seemed to breathe again. Henry then reached into the bag once more and produced a small walnut gavel. The engraving on its handle read, Hon Elijah M. Thompson, U.S. District Judge. He placed it into Elijah's hand, A quiet strength coursed through Elijah's chest as the weight pressed into his palm. Outside the doors, clerks, marshals, and court staff gathered. They whispered to one another, stunned that the defendant brought in bruised and handcuffed was the same man whose rulings shaped their daily work. They watched as the bailiff approached the sound system and positioned himself at the podium. His voice, time-worn and steady from thousands of mornings, boomed through the speakers with solemn reverence. All rise. The words struck like a bell. Conversations halted. Footsteps froze. Even the officers straightened involuntarily at the command. Henry continued, his voice resonant, carrying the authority of tradition. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia is now in session. The Honorable Judge Elijah Marcus Thompson presiding. The courtroom doors opened wide. Elijah stepped through in full robe, the bruise along his cheek stark against the dark fabric. He walked slowly, each step measured, as if reclaiming ground taken from him unjustly. The gallery rose as one. Even those who had doubted him minutes earlier stood in reverent silence. Ramirez stared straight ahead, eyes darting, knees trembling. Santos's hands twitched at his sides as though searching for an anchor. Bennett looked ready to collapse entirely. The irony washed over them with crushing force. This morning they had believed they commanded the courtroom. Now they stood in the presence of the man whose authority dwarfed every badge in the building. Elijah reached the bench. Judge Hayes waited beside it, robe open, humility etched across his face. He stepped aside with a slight bow of respect. "It is your courtroom." "Judge Thompson." Elijah nodded once, without flourish, without anger. He ascended the steps behind the bench and took the seat that had always borne his name. As he adjusted his robe and placed the gavel on the bench before him, a calm descended over the room, a calm shaped not by fear, but by recognition. Justice had returned to its rightful place. He lifted his eyes toward the officers. Their earlier confidence had dissolved entirely. Ramirez gripped the rail before him to steady himself. Santos blinked rapidly, sweat forming at his temple. Bennett lowered his gaze to the floor. Elijah watched them with quiet clarity. He felt neither vengeance nor hatred. What he felt was purpose, purpose anchored by years of service, years of rulings, years of listening to voices silenced by people who believed uniforms insulated them from accountability. "Be seated," he said softly. The room obeyed instantly. His voice carried the weight of every gavel he had ever struck. "We will now resume proceedings," he continued. This time, with the full truth before us. The silence that followed held more power than any outburst could provide. Ramirez opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His story, once firm and rehearsed, now seemed fragile, almost absurd. Nothing he could say would outrun the evidence about to be revealed. Elijah looked to Henry, who stood ready near the control panel. "Mr. Lawson, please prepare the courtroom monitors," Elijah said. "We will begin with the security footage." Henry nodded. He moved swiftly, activating the screens mounted along the walls. Elijah tapped the gavel lightly against the desk. The faint wooden knock echoed through the hall. Steady, deliberate, familiar. It was a sound that signaled order, truth, and the beginning of accountability. For a moment, Elijah closed his eyes. He felt the robe against his shoulders, the ache in his jaw, and the strength that came from standing again in the place where justice was meant to be spoken clearly. When he opened his eyes, they were focused, clear, unwavering. The robe was no longer just a garment. It was the promise that the truth, once revealed, would not be denied. The courtroom screens brightened as Bailiff Henry Lawson pressed the controls, and every eye fixed on the monitors glowing against the paneled walls. Elijah Thompson sat behind the bench, his robe steady around his shoulders. the bruise along his cheek darkening as the morning's violence echoed back at him. He lifted the gavel slightly, not to strike it, but to steady himself, then lowered his hand and spoke with calm authority. "Mr. Lawson, begin the footage." The mute security recording filled the screens. The images played in crisp clarity. Elijah ascending the courthouse steps with a briefcase in hand, Ramirez approaching with hostile posture, Santos and Bennett standing to the side. Phones raised. The punch landed without hesitation, without provocation. The courtroom gasped as Elijah's body jerked from the strike. They watched his head snap to the left, watched the papers explode across the granite, watched Ramirez slam him against the wall while the other officers laughed. With every frame, silence deepened. It was the silence of undeniable truth, truth captured by a camera immune to pride or lies. Elijah did not flinch as he relived the moment. He remained still, hands folded, gaze forward. He wanted the room to see what he had seen, feel what he had felt. He wanted the facts to speak, because facts, once revealed, demand judgment. When the recording ended, Elijah spoke in a soft tone that carried to every corner. "We will now review the body camera backup." Henry switched sources. The screen went black for 2 seconds. Then the feed appeared with audio restored. Ramirez's voice filled the speakers, sharper than any accusation spoken earlier. Another entitled one thinking he owns the place. The officer muttered, unaware the camera, though he believed it off, was uploading every 30 seconds to a secure cloud server. Time to teach a lesson. The courtroom froze. Mitchell, the prosecutor, slowly lowered her hand from her face. Hayes stared into the screen with a mixture of horror and shame. Santos's voice chimed in faintly from the background, laughing as he held his phone. "Get it on your camera, too," he said, "just in case." The recording continued, unspooling the truth in a steady, damning line. Ramirez said nothing to request identification. Santos gave no command. Bennett offered no warning. The attack was immediate and deliberate. Elijah let the audio play without interruption, even as his cheek throbbed at the memory. When the video reached the moment Ramirez slammed him against the wall, the officer's voice grew sharper. "People like you belong behind bars." The hateful tone reverberated through the courtroom. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the officers' attorneys, who had entered moments earlier after the recess, stared at the screen with an expression that betrayed the futility of defense. When the footage ended, Henry paused the recording at the exact moment Ramirez's fist connected with Elijah's cheek. The image stared back at the courtroom like an indictment carved in light. Elijah folded his hands. "The evidence," he said quietly, "shall be stronger than any testimony provided today." He nodded toward Henry. "Bring in the briefcase." The bailiff walked to the side door and returned with the scuffed leather case that had been scattered across the steps. Papers protruded from its corners. Testimony to the chaos of the morning. Henry placed it on the table before Elijah. The judge opened the latch with a steady hand and withdrew a thick manila folder stamped with a red seal. "United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Confidential." Elijah looked toward Ramirez. "Officer, you may want to sit." Ramirez sank down without argument. Elijah placed the folder on the bench and opened it slowly. "This," he said, "is the material I was scheduled to review at 8:37 this morning with 2 Justice Department attorneys." The room leaned forward. "It contains preliminary findings from a 14-month investigation into racial bias and unlawful use of force within the Atlanta Police Department." He lifted the first document. A chart filled the page. Complaints, dates, outcomes. "Officer Daniel Alejandro Ramirez," Elijah said evenly, "has 35 sustained or pending internal affairs complaints." Ramirez's shoulders tightened. Elijah continued. 80% involve Black or Latino citizens. Many include allegations of excessive force or fabricated justification. He lifted another sheet. 7 civil suits settled quietly by the city, 5 with non-disclosure agreements, 2 still pending appeal. He turned another page. Arrest rates for people of color under Officer Ramirez's patrol area exceed the surrounding population by 28 percentage points. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply presented the information as a man who had lived inside the truth long before today's violence caught the world's attention. "These documents," he said, "were assembled during a pattern or practice investigation that I personally supervised during the past 14 months. He closed the folder gently. The meeting scheduled for this morning was to review the evidence before submitting the findings to Chief Judge Rivera. Ramirez lowered his head. His face drained of color. He looked suddenly smaller, stripped of the authority he had wielded so casually hours earlier. And then Elijah spoke the sentence that tightened every spine in the room. "Officer Ramirez, 6 years ago you arrested my son for matching a description. The charges were dismissed, but he carries the memory still." Elijah paused, his voice steady but softened by a private ache. "This morning, the description finally matched someone you could not intimidate into silence." The officers flinched. Mitchell brought a hand to her chest. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Justice, long quiet, was beginning to speak. Elijah straightened in his chair. "This court," he said, "must now determine whether the conduct shown in these recordings, combined with the pattern of behavior documented in this investigation, constitutes criminal violation of civil rights under color of law." He tapped the gavel lightly. "The law recognizes no badge that stands above its reach." Santos rose suddenly, as if his conscience had gripped him by the shoulders. His voice trembled. "Your Honor." "I." Elijah raised a hand. "Officer Santos, you will have the opportunity to testify under oath." Santos nodded, unable to speak further. Bennett wiped sweat from his brow. His earlier arrogance dissolved into dread. Elijah's voice carried across the room with calm authority. "This court will allow full presentation of evidence. We will examine every frame, every recording, every file." He leaned forward slightly. "The truth, once revealed, cannot be hidden again." In the stillness that followed, the courtroom understood something profound. This was no longer a case about a mistaken encounter. This was the unmasking of an entire pattern of abuse, and as the evidence illuminated the truth, the balance of power shifted permanently. The officers had relied on lies, but lies had limits. Evidence did not. Elijah lifted the gavel. Its weight felt heavier now, shaped by the pain of the morning and the purpose of the moment. He struck it once. The sound echoed like a verdict not yet spoken, steady, resonant, and unavoidable. Justice had entered the room, and it would not leave quietly. 3 days later, the courtroom filled again, this time with a weight far heavier than before. What had begun as a simple arraignment had transformed into a formal hearing overseen by the Department of Justice. Subpoenas had been issued. Witnesses had been sworn. Exhibits had been entered into the record. The truth, captured in every frame, every audio file, and every affidavit, had stripped the room of doubt and revealed a pattern of cruelty that could no longer hide behind procedure. Elijah Thompson sat behind the bench in full robe, posture straight, eyes calm. The bruise on his cheek had begun to fade, but the memory of the strike remained vivid in every person who sat in the gallery. Ramirez sat shackled at the defense table, wrists bound in front of him, shoulders slumped with defeat. His attorney sat stiffly at his side, unable to refute the mountain of evidence. Santos and Bennett, who had once laughed on the courthouse steps, now sat as charged witnesses awaiting their own proceedings. Hayes and Mitchell were present too, not out of obligation but out of recognition. Recognition that they had been inches from allowing a lie to become law. Elijah glanced at the clock above the rear doors. The hour had arrived. He raised the gavel slightly, then set it down gently. This court is now prepared to render its decision. His voice carried across the room, steady and measured, as though speaking through the fabric of the robe itself. The gallery leaned forward, breath held, waiting for the moment accountability would finally speak. Defendant, rise. Ramirez stood slowly, his chains rattling as he pushed himself upright. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, his expression a mixture of regret and disbelief. He had entered this courthouse hundreds of times with the confidence of a man who thought the badge on his chest was a shield that nothing could pierce. Today, the badge was gone. Today, the shield had shattered. Elijah folded his hands on the bench. This court has reviewed the evidence in full. He began. We have examined the security footage. We have reviewed the body camera recordings. We have taken testimony from experts, from witnesses, and from officers under oath. We have considered the investigative findings from the Department of Justice. His tone remained formal. But every sentence carried the weight of truth, earned through suffering. The facts are clear. The conduct shown in the recordings is not an act of misjudgment. It is not a moment of confusion. It is a deliberate assault on a citizen who posed no threat, driven by prejudice and sustained by false testimony. Ramirez lowered his head. Elijah continued. Furthermore, the evidence establishes a sustained pattern of behavior, spanning more than 12 years, in which you used your authority to intimidate, humiliate, and harm individuals based on race. 35 internal affairs complaints, 7 civil settlements, numerous disciplinary recommendations ignored or buried, and a documented pattern of disproportionate enforcement against Black and Latino residents. He paused, allowing the words to sink into the stunned silence. This court has seen many forms of misconduct, but what stands before us today is more than misconduct. It is a betrayal of the public trust. Santos swallowed hard. Bennett stared at the floor. Even the spectators who had no connection to the case felt the gravity of the moment settle over them like a quiet storm. Elijah lifted a document from the bench. Daniel Alejandro Ramirez, you are hereby found guilty of assault on a federal officer, a violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 111. You are found guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, and you are found guilty of perjury before this court. He closed the document and set it aside. For these offenses, the court imposes the following sentence. The room stiffened. On the charge of assault on a federal officer, 5 years in federal custody. On the charge of deprivation of civil rights, 10 years in federal custody, without possibility of parole, to run consecutively. On the charge of perjury, 3 years in federal custody, to run concurrently. Elijah paused, his voice firm but never cruel. Your law enforcement certification is permanently revoked. All pension and benefits are forfeited. Upon release, you will be under federal supervision for 5 additional years. The chain at Ramirez's ankles shook as his knees buckled. He gripped the table to prevent himself from falling. A soft, broken sound escaped his throat, half sob, half disbelief. Elijah watched him with steady eyes. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no triumph, only the solemn weight of duty. This sentence, Elijah said gently, is not vengeance. It is accountability. He let the silence settle for a long moment. Accountability for me. Accountability for my son. And accountability for every citizen you harmed while wearing the authority of a badge you did not deserve. Tears streamed down Ramirez's face. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, but Ramirez hardly felt it. Months earlier, he had mocked the idea of ever facing consequences. Now consequences stood before him in a black robe. Elijah spoke again, maintaining the same calm cadence. This court will also issue an order referring this matter to the Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, the Georgia Board of Public Safety, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The evidence presented here will be reviewed in full. Additional charges may follow. He turned his gaze toward Santos and Bennett. You both will remain under federal supervision pending your own hearings. Neither officer spoke. Neither raised a hand to wipe their tears. They sat still, as though movement itself might fracture the fragile composure they were clinging to. Elijah picked up the gavel, feeling its weight settle into his palm like the fulfillment of a long, painful promise. It is the ruling of this court, he concluded, that justice be served, not as a moment of anger, but as a commitment to truth, fairness, and the dignity of every person who enters these doors. He struck the gavel once. The sound echoed like a final breath, leaving an old lie. When he set the gavel down, Ramirez collapsed into his chair, shaking. The marshals moved forward. Their steps were steady, professional, unhurried. They lifted Ramirez gently by the arms, secured his chains, and guided him toward the aisle as he passed the gallery. No one spoke. No one looked away. A lifetime of unchallenged authority had ended not in confrontation, but in the quiet, immovable presence of the law. Elijah watched them escort him out. His expression remained steady. His voice had been firm, but his heart felt the weight of what accountability truly demanded. Justice was never loud. Justice never rushed. Justice never shouted. Justice simply arrived and stayed. And in that moment, the courtroom understood. This was not the end of a case. It was the beginning of a reckoning. 6 months passed, and the memory of that morning on the courthouse steps no longer lived only in the bruise that had faded from Elijah Thompson's cheek. It lived in the decisions issued by the Justice Department. It lived in the testimony delivered before Congress. It lived in the quiet reforms spreading across the Atlanta Police Department like long-delayed sunlight breaking through cloud. What began as a single violent moment grew into a full federal reckoning. The pattern or practice probe, once confined to a single sealed folder in Elijah's briefcase, expanded into a citywide investigation led by a rotating team of civil rights attorneys and federal auditors. They reviewed body camera archives, internal affairs complaints, prosecution files, and thousands of hours of footage long buried by procedural red tape. One by one, truths surfaced. 19 officers, not just 3, were implicated in coordinated misconduct. 9 were terminated. 3 were indicted for conspiracy and evidence tampering. Others resigned quietly. Aware that their histories would not survive federal scrutiny, the city reopened 312 cases tied to the officers involved. 41 people walked free. 68 saw their convictions vacated or sentences reduced. The courtroom where Elijah had once presided in peace now saw families return to reclaim dignity they thought lost forever. Atlanta issued another $6.2 million in civil settlements, with a significant portion deducted directly from the police department's operating budget. That decision, quiet, administrative, uncelebrated, became its own message. It told the city that misconduct carried a cost, a real cost, one that could not be buried beneath paperwork or passed to insurance within the department. Change arrived not through slogans, but through directives typed on simple white paper. Every directive carried the same conclusion at the bottom, mandated by the Office of the Inspector General pursuant to federal oversight. Body cameras were replaced with models that uploaded continuously to a tamper-proof cloud archive. Officers no longer controlled their own footage. They could not pause it. They could not delete it. They could not adjust it. Every 30 seconds. The truth flowed into a secure server monitored by independent auditors. Implicit bias training, once treated as an annual formality, became a quarterly requirement certified by the Department of Justice. Supervisors attended separate sessions on racial equity enforcement, search and seizure standards, and disciplinary transparency. A civilian oversight board gained new statutory authority to issue subpoenas and demand internal files within strict deadlines. The City Council passed reforms mandating public release of use of force data and complaint outcomes. None of these measures were dramatic. None were dramatic enough for headlines. But each one tightened the net around the silent habits that had shaped misconduct for years. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his work with a steady humility. He refused every media interview. Despite repeated requests from national outlets, his clerks handled the inquiries with polite firmness. Judge Thompson is not available for comment. The truth was that he did not seek national attention. He wanted the institution he served to stand tall, not because his face appeared on the news, but because the law itself had been restored. He continued hearing cases. He continued mentoring young law clerks. He continued reviewing Department of Justice filings late at night with quiet discipline. Occasionally, when the courthouse grew still, he would pause at the window overlooking the granite steps. He no longer saw the moment he was struck. He saw instead the moment the system confronted itself. One morning in early spring, reporters gathered again on those same steps. They expected a press conference, a statement, a triumphant declaration. Instead, Elijah walked out with a gentle pace, hands folded before him, robe absent, suit neat, expression composed, microphones clustered toward him. A reporter called out, "Judge Thompson, do you believe justice was served?" Another shouted, "Do you feel vindicated?" Elijah raised one hand slightly, signaling calm. He waited until the crowd quieted, then he spoke with the clarity of a man who understood both pain and purpose. "Justice," he said, "does not shout. Justice does not rush. Justice simply refuses to look away when the evidence demands it be seen." His voice carried through the plaza with a steady resonance. Each word shaped for meaning, not applause. He paused, letting the silence settle. This was never about a single moment. He continued, "It was about the system we are entrusted to uphold, and the system is strongest when it confronts its own failures with honesty." The reporters stood still, unsure whether to ask another question. Elijah gave a small nod, signaling the moment was complete. He turned and walked down the steps, the same steps where the morning's violence had begun. This time he walked not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a judge fulfilling his duty with dignity. Behind him, the brass plaque newly mounted beside the courthouse entrance caught the morning light. It read, "In this courthouse, no badge stands above the law." Visitors paused to read it. Officers passing by slowed for a moment, some with respect, some with unease. Clerks touched the plaque gently as they entered the building for work. It became a quiet reminder of a truth too long forgotten, far beyond Atlanta. The echoes traveled. Other departments requested copies of the new audit guidelines. Federal courts across the country cited the case in training materials. Civil rights organizations referenced the ruling in policy proposals. But inside Elijah's heart, the significance was simpler. He thought of his son Jamal, once handcuffed on a sidewalk for matching a description. Now a third-year law student determined to fight the same battles his father had faced. He thought of the families who had reopened their cases with trembling hope. He thought of the officers whose careers had been built on fear and who now faced accountability not as punishment, but as necessary consequence. He thought of the courthouse itself, the place he loved, the place he respected, the place he nearly entered in chains, on the last day of the federal review period. Elijah remained in his chambers after dusk. He turned off the desk lamp, gathered his files, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. His gaze drifted to the black robe hanging on the hook near the bookshelf. It looked still, almost solemn in the quiet light. He touched the sleeve gently, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of responsibility, a reminder of what a single morning had revealed, a reminder of what justice must always be: steady, unbroken, guided by truth. When he finally stepped into the hallway, the building was silent. His footsteps echoed softly down the corridor. He walked toward the elevator with the calm assurance of a man who had fulfilled his duty. And though the city outside moved on with its ordinary rhythms, something fundamental had shifted. A lie had been exposed. A system had been corrected. A judge had stood his ground. And justice, quiet, patient, unyielding, had echoed far beyond the courtroom where it began. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.